You know, when God talks to us, the next thing we need to do is we need to act on what He's saying. And that doesn't mean you need to take great flying leaps into the unknown. But we do need to take at least small steps in the direction God is talking to us about, and then see what develops from there. There was a pastor that I used to meet for lunch once a month. I was pastoring in Detroit, Michigan, so was he. And God tended to talk to both of us about the same things, and we would get together, and if God was talking to him about something, he was talking to me about it too, and we would begin to compare what God had been telling us, and well, we would learn from each other. And more than once we sat there with tears pouring down our face in a restaurant because the presence of God was touching us richly as we shared what God had been talking to us about. But one time I met him, and he said, I think God might be talking to me about making a trip to Africa. Well, why don't you go, I said. I had maybe more of an inclination toward foreign missions than most of my friends in ministry in those days. And so I said, why don't you go? He said, well, for one thing, I don't really have the money in the budget for the trip. He says, it would be about $1,500. He said, and then the church has just been in a little bit of a tight time financially, and I don't really feel like asking the church to pay for it. And he says, frankly, I've never even thought about traveling overseas. He says, I don't even have a passport. I said, well, why don't you at least get your passport? And he says, well, what does it cost to get one? I said, $75 for 10 years. And I happened to know the price that was current at that time because I always made sure my passport was in order. I said, can you afford to get a passport? He says, well, yeah, I can afford that. I thought he could. He seemed to be a little better off than I was, so I thought he could afford a passport. I said, well, why don't you at least get your passport? Because if God isn't saying Africa, let's face it, sooner or later he's going to want to send you somewhere, so you may as well have your passport. And if you are going to go to Africa, you're going to need your passport for Africa. So why don't you take the step you can take without making waves, and then see what happens after that. Well, we met again a month later. And he says, I got my passport. He says, and after I got the passport, he says, we had an elders meeting. He says, and so I just mentioned to them that I felt that God might be telling me to make a trip to Africa at some point. He says, but before I could talk to them about what the needs would be, they said, Pastor, we're 100% behind you. We believe this is a trip that needs to happen. They said, and we know things have been tight in the church financially lately, but we feel like the church is supposed to pay your way. Now you see what happened? He heard something from God, and once he acted, taking the small step that he could afford to take, then God moved on the other people so that the rest of the trip could fall into place. And he made his trip to Africa, and the trip was blessed, and he came back with good stories to tell and good testimonies of things that God had done. But you see, this is the thing that we need to learn to do. We don't have to take great flying leaps, give up everything you've already got so that you can immediately rush to Africa if God talks to you about it. But take a step in that direction and then wait and give God time to work. We're going to look a little bit more about this in another video about the wisdom of God and going just a step out of our comfort zone. Not a wild leap out of it, but just a step. There are wise ways to respond when God speaks. But if you take those little steps in the direction of acting on God's word, you're going to hear more from God. And sometimes it's not just hearing, but sometimes God's going to do things as well that'll make it possible for you to step into new adventures with him. So we're going to look at that a bit more in the next video.